Hey, this is Les from the TV Dudes. I spent this past weekend in the Driscoll Hotel in scenic Austin, Texas, for the Austin Film Festival in its 26th year. As part of that, I was lucky enough to get to chat with Bob Dearden. He was a writer on iZombie, played again Dick, and also worked on the Veronica Mars movie. And we talk about his time at UT, what got him into film school, television in general, and the role of a mentor in his career. It's a great chat, and I hope you enjoy. So this is Les for the TV Dude, and I'm lucky enough to be sitting here chatting with Bob Dearden.
Hi there.
So we discussed a little bit off mic that you went to UT as well for got your MFA.
Right.
Before that, you were planting trees in Canada?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a very uncommon and unknown sort of sub-industry down here, but it's somewhat common up there as a bit of a rite of passage, at least among a certain type of person in their early 20s or mid-20s. And it's a great job because it's seasonal, and so when you're in college, the season lines up perfectly, and that's how I started. That's how a lot of people do it, just a way to pay for your tuition and the usual stuff. And for me, it turned into a bit of an accidental career that lasted about 12 or 13 years before I finally figured out that maybe it was getting towards sundown for trying something else. And that's when I went back to school and applied to UT among a few other schools and ended up here. But it's all of the, just to give you a tiny bit of background, all of the forested land, almost all of it in Canada, is owned by the government. And so the lumber companies lease that land to log it, and a condition of the lease is that they reforest it at the same sort of volume in which they've cut stuff down. And so this sub-industry developed where a bunch of kids go out into the woods and live in tents in these remote camps for 3 or 4 months. And it's what's called a piece rate job, which means the more you plant, the more you make. So it's a grind, and it's all weather. There's no respite from the conditions, whatever they may be, and it can be a pretty adventurous way to spend a couple of summers in your early 20s. Like I said, I took it a bit further than most people did, but loved it and would love to get back to it if it were socially appropriate, which it is no longer at my age.
That experience of, I would imagine, some solitude and some just being in the woods, even though you're working, I would feel like would lend itself quite well to the mindset that you need to write. I think often a lot of us trying to write, the first big challenge that everybody has to overcome is tuning out the city and tuning out your friends and shutting off your phone. And I would imagine that normalizing and kind of getting used to that muscle memory of getting into that space and being alone with your thoughts. Do you feel like that carried forward or helped you any?
Yes and no. I would say that it's certainly at the time, because you're spending 9 hours a day sort of thing, mostly by yourself with very little contact with your coworkers. And so you have a lot of time to think about whatever pops into your head. And for me at that time, I was not pursuing any sort of education in screenwriting, but it had been something I was interested in as an undergrad and just sort of got backburnered. And just generally speaking, I was, pretty obsessed with movies and television and just a big fan of a lot of stuff. So I can remember, sort of occupying my thoughts in a manner in which I hoped the day would pass more quickly. By thinking about Lost was the big TV show at that time, and so I would go over all the theories of what everything meant in my head, in my land as I worked, and so that was a good distraction. And I also would theorize what the Matrix sequels would be and things like that. So I kind of imagine where things I already watched were going. So it sort of cultivated, I guess, a little bit of a storytelling instinct or whatever. I actually find it harder now, almost because of that, when I am working in the city, because I want to get back to that, but it's hard to, find that sort of solitude. But I find whenever I get, stuck on something, or I hit a bit of a wall or a block, going for a walk or a drive, or just kind of doing anything else that's a little bit mindless and a little bit active at the same time, just sort of clears the clutter in that same way. So it's a little bit of a a microcosmic version of that macro experience of being alone with your thoughts all day that I try to reach back to when I get stuck.
Was it? It had to have been jarring, but can you talk a bit about the transition back from not just that level of solitude, but any type of professionalism and professional career, and then shifting gears back to education, where now you're expected to sit in a room, respond occasionally,
right,
but mostly just accept info. Can you talk about kind of shifting back to, I want to do something, I don't know how to do it, I need to go learn?
Right. Well, it was it's a somewhat tough process, but I had taken a online course from UCLA. I believe it's called the Professional Program in Screenwriting. Excuse me. So I'd done that while I was still kind of working that job over one winter, and the following fall was when I came to UT. So I had a little bit of a ramp-up introduction into what, the screenwriting workshops would be. And it was very similar, except that it was over Skype as opposed to in person. But certainly the transition from kind of being on your feet all day and working with logistics, solving logistical problems. By the time I was finishing that career, I was more working in a supervisory capacity or administrative capacity, still out in the woods, but I was no longer planting trees all day. I was sort of managing all of the other people that were. So again, less of a transition because I was already spending a bit of time just sort of sitting at a desk and that sort of thing, a makeshift desk in the woods. But yeah, no matter what you go into after a concentrated summer of being out in that type of environment, whether it's, oil rigging or mining or anything like that, any sort of natural resources sort of labor, getting back to the world is both physically and psychologically jarring at first, but it doesn't take long to get back into the swing. What was really tough was sort of sitting still for 3 hours while somebody lectured. But my experience as an undergrad was the same, I think, that a lot of people, at least in my generation, had, where there wasn't a whole lot of thought put into it. It was just kind of a given that you would go to college if you could after high school, and that if you didn't, you wouldn't have you'd have a lot of doors closed to you, and so that's just the path everyone took. And so I suppose I didn't question it that much, and I treated it a little bit like second high school in that I just went with whatever path I was on and whatever I was sort of told to do to follow that. But the second time around, I knew that I was making, at the very least, a financial sacrifice and sacrificing a couple years of my life on what, was a bit of a pipe dream in terms of what it could potentially lead to or what I hoped it would lead to. Obviously, now looking back, it all worked out well, but at the time, I had no idea what was going to come of it, other than I knew I was giving up, a couple years of working and depleting my savings that I had accumulated to that point. So I knew that I couldn't just go along for the ride. I had to sort of take advantage of the resources and everything that was available in that graduate program. So I was a little more motivated, I guess, to not just be a passenger, and that helped, but it certainly wasn't easy to sit in a classroom for, 3 hours every afternoon and listen to somebody talk.
Your, I don't know if internship is the term, but when you started working for Rob Thomas, who's the creator of Veronica Mars, both versions of Cupid, iZombie, the Lost Boys show that we all wish was on the air.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about what you expected from that process and what you got instead?
I don't know that I had any real expectations. I suppose I had hopes that it would turn into a relationship that would turn into some, sort of foot in the door and possible employment. I never would have expected it to have worked out as well as it did. And not to put words in Rob's mouth, but he might even say something similar. It's a little bit overstating my impact on his life. His has been quite a bit more on mine, but we have continued to work together, and hopefully we'll continue to work together. Past this point, 5 years later, and I don't think either of us would have imagined that, from our first meeting here, that would be the result down the road. But I suppose I expected anything. I mean, I didn't know if it would be what you typically hear of as the tasks of an intern, sort of more menial and mundane things, or if it would be, sort of spread out, just an hour here, an hour there, and maybe a bit more of a loose mentorship. But what it turned into was there was at least 2 or 3 mornings a week where I would spend 2 or 3 hours with him while he was working on his various projects, which at the time were 3 separate pilot scripts that he had in various stages of development. And essentially, right from the beginning, there was never anything mundane or never any sort of errands asked of me or anything like that. It was just being privy to his process. And I think at first it was more of just I was kind of a mostly silent sounding board for him to talk through whatever he was working on that morning. And he would shift back and forth between, one pilot script and another, depending on what might be due on a given day. But I would just show up, and whatever he was working on that day, I would sort of listen to him work through stuff, and it evolved slowly as I guess I got more comfortable and a little bit more confident that every once in a while I would respond and have a pitch to throw at him. Minor stuff, not talking about big picture things at all, but just how to exit a scene, or how to this one beat, how to execute that. And so that sort of, I guess, engendered a bit of it certainly wasn't symbiosis because I wasn't anywhere near his level, but as I gained confidence in, I guess, my ability to share that room with him, I think he also gained confidence in my ability to add a tiny little bit to his process. And more than anything, I think it was good for him to have somebody there to talk things through with, even if he was doing most of the talking. And it probably kept him on task a tiny bit more than it might have otherwise, because you're not going to veer off into a internet rabbit hole while somebody is sitting
just
there
standing there
beside you. Yeah. And I'm mostly guessing at that, but I think overall it was helpful enough to him that he wanted to keep going, and he even invited a couple more of my classmates to join us as well. And then all 3 of us ended up getting our first jobs in LA through that process at the end of that year, working as assistants on the Veronica Mars movie. And the relationships there continue again to this day. So it's been much, much more than I ever would have expected.
Yeah, I was going to say that was back in the Kickstarter movie time period for Mars, right?
That's right, yeah.
And I got to talk to Rob briefly at ATX Fest this past year, and
right.
He talked about that Kickstarter money being some of the hardest money he's ever put together. For as simple as it seems,
right?
That hustling for Kickstarter is a whole other skill set than normal production,
right?
Or normal fundraising or whatever.
Yeah, and they really, kind of, I think we're setting the bar for, the rewards and the interaction and everything that came with it. So
yeah, I've got my DVD.
Yeah, I think I ended up with a poster. I don't remember. I was a poor student at the time, so I was a lower level contributor. But all of those sort of perks, I guess, were pretty logistically difficult to bring together, involving a ton of moving parts, and even when they were shooting the movie, one of the higher end donations got you a set visit. So there'd be days where they were shooting, and it was packed. It was a really ambitious script for the budget they had. So every day was jam packed, but they would still make time for 50 people to come on set and meet everybody at lunch. And of course, the actors carried a lot of that weight because that's who people wanted to actually have FaceTime with, but. And there was another reward that got you to be an extra. It was in the high school reunion scenes at the hotel there, and integrating that with people that are not necessarily used to being on a set and not necessarily as, I don't want to say as professional, but they were there because they were fans of the show. So of course it was hard for them to not act like fans of the show, and all of the extra just little pressures and time consumption that piled on to what was already a fairly jam-packed shoot didn't affect my life or my job, but I certainly saw the impact on the people that were in charge of it. It was a big undertaking.
Can you talk about transitioning from that to and kind of interning with Rob to your career now, like working on iZombie, working on things now?
Yeah, the first after I interned for Rob, the first job I had, like I said, was an office PA job on the movie, which then led to being Rob's assistant again a few months later as he was in post-production on the movie, simultaneously working on the pilot for iZombie along with another couple of pilots. So it was kind of, it was a more comprehensive assistant role, but it also went back to, that sort of private writer's room type experience in that I was sort of taking notes for him and the co-creator of iZombie, Diane Ruggiero-Wright. And every once in a while, sort of like trying to contribute a little something, and he was generous enough and trusted me enough to allow me to participate that way. That then led to being the assistant to all the producers on the pilot, which led to being an writer's assistant, which for anyone who doesn't know is essentially like the stenographer of the discussion in the writer's room for season 1, which in turn led to a freelance script in season 1. And again, for people that may not be aware, the Guild sort of mandates that every season of every show has one script that's written by somebody who's not on the permanent staff. Sometimes I think a fine is just sort of paid and they don't do that, or sometimes a very experienced writer who's not on staff is hired, but more often than not, that script is given to sort of an up-and-coming person in a support staff role. And so I was lucky enough to get that the first season. Right as that was happening, my student visa ran out. I had to go back to Canada. But again, Rob and all of the powers that be were generous enough to give me a job on the production side because the show was shot in Vancouver. So as I was finishing my draft of my first, freelance script for television, I was first driving north with all of my belongings and then, setting up shop in the office there and tending to those responsibilities, which really, we had a joke that I was my job title was the birthday wrangler because most of my time was spent going out getting birthday cakes for whoever's birthday it was in the office that week. So it wasn't the toughest job, but they were nice enough to at least kind of give me a paycheck and keep me in the family. And then I guess they liked the freelance script enough to hire me on staff for the second season. And that job, along with a few other hurdles I had to clear, were enough to get me a different type of visa to come back. And so from that point forward, I worked on all 4 of those, like season 2 through 5 of iZombie. And that was all great. Sad that it ended, but, a really fun show to work on for those 5 years. And then the only job I've had since then, which just wrapped, was on the writer staff of season 3 of Cobra Kai.
Which, iZombie wrapped up incredibly well. There have been a lot of shows that have ended in the last few years, and I've been really impressed with some of the ending. I loved the end of iZombie.
Oh, that's great.
And
great
I think Cobra Kai just surprised all of us that there was an interview with Ralph Macchio about how many times a year since the original Karate Kid he's been offered something.
Right.
And that it's just a knee-jerk reflex, no.
Right.
And that really it was the premise of Cobra Kai hooked him, and he was like, well, maybe this could be good. But we've all been, the number of my friends whose reaction to that has been, oh my God, have you watched this?
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah. There is a general sense of surprise to it, because I think we all maybe, without having been offered various Karate Kid projects over the years, had similar reactions when we heard about it that you mentioned Ralph Macchio did. My reaction was sort of like, oh, why? But then when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is fantastic.
I couldn't believe after that first season how much I felt for Johnny.
Yeah.
And just stunned, but without undercutting or redoing the original movie. He's still the villain for me in that movie.
Right.
But I also have sympathy for him.
Yeah.
Which was a pretty amazing turn.
Yeah, to me it is what they did in the first season especially, and I love the second just as much, but, it starts to focus a little more on the kids there, but it's really just a masterclass in sort of subverting something while paying homage to it at the same time. It's such a fine line, and I think they found the perfect balance, and I think it's just so funny and heartfelt and well done and well thought out. And it was just, I was very happily surprised that I got to be part of the third season.
In terms of coming aboard for a third season of something, because it is like you said, it is a fine line to walk between doing something new with it, but not ruining the old. They don't kick the legs out from under Karate Kid. They really do take a love of it.
Right.
And deepen it.
Right.
Can you talk about coming in on season 3 and what you personally, what does Bob want to do on the show versus what does the show need?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, it was basically my second job, and the first 5 years of my career had all been with this group of people that, at the head of which was a guy I'd interned for a couple years and assisted a couple years before that. So it felt like, I was in the warm embrace of friends and mentors and family, and also was on iZombie in some capacity from before it was a show. And so I had that sort of continuity, and I got how, Rob liked things done, even though I may not have adhered to that all the time. I understood the lay of the land very clearly. So it was very daunting to go into not only a whole new experience with new people, but one in which most of the people that I'd be working with had been on for seasons 1 and 2. Add to that the fact that I just thought it was so good that I was a little bit nervous, like, am I going to measure up to these guys? Because I felt like I had gotten, okay at knowing what iZombie's tone was by the end. But that was one specific experience, and I wasn't sure if, I had the writing chops to necessarily, like, find the right tone or sweet spot for, for this other show that I had come into as a huge fan, really. But everybody was incredibly welcoming, and the showrunners there are fantastic. And it was just like, it was a really fun environment. I mean, it's not a straight comedy, but it certainly is more of a comedy than iZombie was, or more of a traditional comedy, being a half hour. And so it was, jokes were flying, and it lightened the mood right away, and it was great. I don't think I thought about it in terms of, what do I want to bring to the show so much as tried to really listen at the beginning and see where they wanted to go, because obviously the showrunners had spent much of the off season figuring out the broad strokes of what they wanted the serialized arcs to be in the season. So learning what they had in mind first, and then finding the rhythm of the room and listening to what everybody who'd been on the show for 2 years was looking to do. For me, I just had maybe a fan fiction sort of mindset, right? Like the blue sky version of, what if I was just watching this, what do I wish I could see in season 3. And with the way season 2 ended, and I told the guys this in my interview, I was very excited about the possibility of Allie coming back, which they sort of hint at with the her responding as he throws his phone into the sand to his Facebook request, because Elizabeth Shue was the dream girl of my youth, with that and Adventures in Babysitting and Cocktail and everything. So I was really excited that, for that possibility, and I think the guys are on the record, so I don't feel like this is a spoiler, but there is some venturing back to Okinawa and some references to Karate Kid 2 upcoming in this season, which I thought was a really cool new sort of territory to mine. When I was a kid, I saw all those movies. I think the one I remember the most, as most of us do, is the first one. But going back and rewatching the second and the third, and even the Hilary Swank one, and the Jaden Smith, Jackie Chan one, and all of that over and over again, just to try and get to make sure I had canon down, was interesting and sparked a whole bunch of other ideas. And yeah, it was a really cool experience. And I think people are going to be surprised and excited by how much more of the source material there is still to mine after 2 full seasons. And even after this third, once people see it, I think there will be hints at more material to mine in the 4th and beyond.
Yeah, if you had told me that the Karate Kid movies would be this amazingly deep world building like sandbox to play in, I don't know that I'd have thought, yeah, of course, Karate Kid, obviously. It's an endless world.
The Karate Kid cinematic universe.
Yes, right? Exactly. But we're there, man.
Apparently, and I only know this, third hand, but apparently Hilary Swank has mentioned has been asked about it in a couple interviews, and at least in that context has been like, yeah, that'd be cool.
That'd be great.
So you never know. But yeah, I think there's a lot more territory to explore, so hopefully it keeps going for a few more seasons at least.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about it today.
My pleasure.
Hope you enjoy the rest of your film fest.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
The TV Dudes is an independently run podcast and a member of the Electric Sweater Podcast Network. We are exclusively listener-supported. If you'd like to help us out, go to patreon.com/tvdudes. You can like us on Facebook and Twitter at TV Dudes. All the music for our show is by our friend and original TV dude, Gregory J. Amani Smith. To find out more about us, go to thetvdudes.com and electricsweater.com. I'm Grant Davis. Thanks for listening.